Hey guys, what's up? And welcome back to the channel, man. Much appreciated you tuning in. And today we've got a really timely video for you guys. It's actually going to be talking about two of my favorite ways to fish in the springtime of the year, and that's with a floating worm and a fluke. And I've done a little bit about each in the past on some videos, but specifically what I'm going to talk about today is like the floating worm versus the fluke. When you need to throw which one under certain situations, because there's some times that one works a lot better than another. So I'm going to share with you guys a few tips on that. But anyway, first of all, a couple different housekeeping tips. I know for those of you, I announced that I was offering memberships to the channel last week. And for those of you that have signed up for the membership, hold on a second, I got to get, here's Elijah. Because, what do you say, morning?
Good morning.
Okay. Man, every time I do a video, it's like clockwork anymore. He comes right out, or Sage barks or something. It's like clockwork. So anyway, I offered memberships to the channel last week, and basically with these memberships, I was offering additional perks like extra videos that aren't going to be seen by regular viewership. And I just want to let everybody know that has signed up for that I'm having a little bit of problems figuring out how to load these videos up to the membership side, so just be patient with me, and we're working on those. And secondly, Johnny and I are we're actually going to do a challenge video on this fluke versus floating worm. It's going to be up in the next couple weeks, so this is going to be sort of a little teaser, to Johnny and I's video that's going to be up on fishthemoment.com in a couple weeks. So anyway, let's get into this particular thing here. Right now, anytime that you've got water temperatures between 55 and 70 degrees in the springtime, and that varies anywhere across the country geographically when you're going to hit that water temperature. Some people, you've hit that a long time. A lot of parts in the country right now, you're right in that zone. And then, some places up north is going to be a little bit later. But there's specific situations, and I'm also going to show you some different rigging tricks here. I've showed a little bit, but I'm going to go in a little bit more detail. There's specific situations when you want to throw what. So let's start out with the ballpark foundation a little bit. First of all, a lot of it has to do with the mood and the personality that the fish are in. And this has a lot to do, when you're talking about floating worm fluke fishing, bass are real sensitive as far as the mood that they're in if they bite these baits. It's like they don't bite them all the time. This is one of those baits, fluke a little bit more than floating worm, but both of these baits have a window that they work in pretty good. And for the most part in the springtime of the year, that window is when those fish first start moving up to spawn. And, not to spawn, but actually to look for spawning beds, and actually right before they go out to deeper water for the post spawn. And I'm going to start out a little bit with the floating worm first. Floating worm, like I said, it's got to be one of my top 3 springtime lures to fish, without a doubt. It's super fun to fish. Most of the time you're seeing... Hold on one second, guys. I got to take care of this toy. Okay, bye, guys. Sorry for all the interruptions. I got out here to the room. It's like all of a sudden, Sage starts barking at squirrels. Elijah comes out to play. Somebody called on the phone. I forgot to put the phone on airplane mode, so we have a little bit of a challenge here. So we're back. Okay, let's get back to the floating worm. Floating worm, like I said, one of my favorite baits to fish in the springtime of the year. There's nothing more exciting than seeing a bass come up and getting a floating worm off close to the surface. And the floating worm is the most sensitive bait I've ever fished as far as getting those fish in the right mode to hit them. And the times that I use the floating worm over the fluke are those times when those bass are super, super close to actually nesting, or if they're nesting, or if they're guarding fry. So you've got a small window when this thing is really effective in there. Most of the time, I let the water temperature be my gauge on a floating worm. I normally don't do that good on a floating worm until that water temperature actually hits 60 degrees. And normally, it gets a little bit better as it warms up closer to 70 degrees. So for me, the window of that floating worm is actually, when you, or I could say, for example, you're fishing down the lake you're fishing and you start seeing a few beds, that's when I usually start throwing a floating worm. And I'll throw it all the way up until the time that I just don't see anything on the beds, any fish on the beds. Another time that I throw a floating worm, another foundational gauge, is weather situations. I only throw a floating worm on some type of a south or southwest wind. A south or southwest wind, for whatever reason, will activate those floating worm fish more than anything else. I prefer a light wind, south-southwest wind, and if the wind switches direction, say out of the north to the east, I put it down. I've learned long ago, under those conditions, when you have a north wind or an east wind or northeast wind, they might look at that thing, but they're not going to eat it very good at all. So weather patterns are real sensitive around that. Another sort of a guideline I have for fishing floating worms is I like to fish it when I'm fishing around some type of a cover, some type of targets. That target could be shallow bank grass. It could be laydowns. Laydowns are awesome around it. You know, laydowns, a floating worm will pull a fish out of a laydown better than any bait I've ever seen. So any type of wood cover, stumps, laydowns, that type of stuff. Docks, dock pilings. You can skip this bait around docks just like you can a wacky rig. So what I'm trying to do with the floating worm is I'm trying to pull bass away from cover with it. And that's when it works a lot better than the Fluke does. Colors, like I said, are real dependent upon water clarity and sky conditions and the mood of the bass. Sort of like with a jerkbait, floating worm is very similar in the fact that bass are real color sensitive to that, and they react to certain colors better than others. And you've got to experiment with that, because you can catch them like on the bright yellow. I don't care if the water visibility's 20 foot deep. I've caught tons of bass in gin clear water on the yellow, and then there's other times they won't even look at it. So you got to get a big variety, man. Just keep it up. I'll show you I showed this the other day, but if you guys didn't catch it, you can see I've got 3 floating worm boxes. This is just one of them with colors in it. So I literally carry 15 different colors and try to match it up to the situation on there. Quick rigging deal with the thing here on the floating worm. I talked about this before, but I want to go over it if you guys hadn't seen it. Don't use too big of a hook. I usually like to use no more than a 2/0 hook, and this is the Zoom trick worm. I'll bite the end off a little bit, and on the Zoom trick worm, you got a flat side and you've got a rounded side. What you want to do is you always want to come through the rounded side of the worm. And I've experimented with all the different sides, and this is going to make that bait work a lot better than if you come through the flat side. So I now use an exposed hook like that. I don't use the Texas rig. With the exposed hook, like I said, you can even fish an exposed hook around cover a lot. But since I'm not actually penetrating the cover, I'm not really getting hung up, and I just get a lot better hookups with the exposed hook than I do with the Texas rig, like a lot of people throw it on. So those are some basic guidelines with the floating worm. Now with the Fluke, a little bit different with the Fluke. The Fluke has got a lot larger window as far as when it works. And again, the Fluke is really productive in a wide range of water clarities. I mean, while I like the floating worm for the most part in a little bit clear water, although they will hit it in dirty water, the Fluke will pull fish out of dirtier water than the floating worm based upon the color you use. A lot of times I'll use, like the whites or something like that if the water's off colored. This one right here is really good color, one of my favorites. But the thing about the Fluke is it's a little bit more of a bait that draws those non-aggressive fish out. Here's the big difference between the Fluke and the floating worm. We talked about the bite window being real small on the floating worm as far as the mood that they're in and the weather conditions and the wind. The thing that's good about a Fluke over a floating worm is it has a lot wider range than the floating worm does. A Fluke will catch bass in a lot more different weather conditions. You can still get bit on a north wind. If you got a cold front, they'll still bite it. They don't bite a floating worm on a cold front very good at all. So the fish will hit it a lot more, and the reason they do is because of the darting action on it. The darting action creates a reaction strike for the bass in shallow water that simply the floating worm can't match. And I want to give you guys a rigging tip here with it. What I'll do is I'll usually take a 3 or 4 straight shank hook, And I showed this on the Sluggo the other day, but this is another secret tip, guys. There's very few people that rig it like this. You want to come through the bottom part of it again, of the Fluke. And this is real tough to do because this Fluke has you see that gap right there? You got to come right through the top hard part here and not get into that gap, or you're going to blow it out. But come through the bottom with it like this. You have to practice a little bit if you're not familiar with it. Most people, Texas rig a Fluke with like an EWG hook. Once you try what I'm going to show you here, you'll never do that again. Come through right at the bottom like that. And you want to have a little bit of pointing down. And what happens this way is this thing right here darts, and you can fish it just like a jerkbait. You can boom, 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 just like a jerkbait, and it'll dart like a jerkbait. And with that exposed hook right there, you never miss them. So try rigging them like that over Texas rig, and I promise you'll get more bites because you get better action, and you'll hook up a lot more when they bite it. Bass are notorious for swiping at a floating worm and a Fluke both. So anytime you got an exposed hook, that really helps out a little bit there. So the thing about a Fluke here again that's different is, okay, number one, we talked about weather. They'll hit it in a wider variety of weather. They'll hit it in a wider variety of water clarities. And also, a Fluke is a great bait to fan cast over areas that do not have cover, specifically if you have water visibilities over 4 feet. I like to go, again, back in those spawning areas, even some secondary points, because they'll hit a Fluke in 55-degree water. They'll hit it sooner in colder water than they will a floating worm. So I'll sometimes get on those staging areas, like a secondary point, and I'll throw that Fluke out there, and I'll count it down just like maybe 5 or 6 feet, and work it underwater like a jerkbait. So I can actually get that Fluke, to go as deep as I want to, because it sinks. And they'll bite it when it's down in the water column, but they won't bite a floating worm very good like that. In the floating worm bite, the personality of the fish has to be where those bass come up on it. Not so on a Fluke. Even though you can catch them like that on a Fluke, you can work a Fluke down deeper just like you do a floating worm. So I start throwing it on those secondary points, working my way back into the spawning pockets, and as I work farther back into the spawning pockets, that's when I fish it shallower. I don't let it get down as deep. I keep it up in sight a lot of times, and I will throw it around targets, but you don't have to have targets. You can just go down a bare bank with the Fluke, and you can catch them really good like that with it. So there's, like I said, there's some similarities and there's some differences. The big difference I'm talking about here is the Fluke has a wider range of conditions where you can get bites in versus a floating worm. Overall, I would say that the bigger fish you catch on these two, the floating worm will produce the bigger fish on average. Say if you catch 50 bass on both of these baits, those 50 bass that come on a floating worm are probably going to be a little bit bigger than the Fluke. I think a lot of that is because the Fluke, sometimes when you fish it fast, a lot of times that will attract a smaller fish. The floating worm will stay in one spot longer since it doesn't sink as fast, and you can work it slower, and I think those bigger ones react to it, even though they have to be in the right mood, so the bite window is just a lot smaller. Another big key on this is rigging them, guys. I rig both of these baits with a barrel swivel. I throw the Fluke on a bait caster most of the time with like 15-pound test fluorocarbon, a barrel swivel about 12 inches above the bait, 15-pound test leader on the thing, and I'll throw the floating worm on a spinning rod with braid. This is one, you guys know I don't use braid to fluorocarbon, but I do use braid on the floating worm on a barrel swivel, on like a 2-foot length barrel swivel with that. And the reason I can do this and get away with it is since most of the time I'm fishing the floating worm high up in the water column, the braid is not really even in the water very much, so I can get away with that. But you definitely want to use a barrel swivel both of the times with these baits, because not only it will keep your line from twisting, but it'll also add a little bit extra weight that gets those baits down a little bit faster, and you can get them a little bit deeper. So anyway, floating worm versus Fluke, most of the time have them both on the deck. Right now, like I said, water temperature 55 to 70 degrees. If I'm on this bite a lot of times, it's rare that I just have one or the other. Most of the time I have a little bit of both. experiment to see which one they want a little bit better. But there's a situation that both of them will work. I mean, both of them can work together and they can work separate. There's just a little bit of differences, but overall, just in review, Fluke is a lot more versatile bait. It'll catch fish in a wider range of weather conditions and water clarities. Floating worm is more situational. It produces more quality bass. There's a smaller bite window, but when that bite window's on, guys, on a floating worm, you don't want to miss it because nothing can compete with it. The Fluke can't compete with it. Nothing can when that bite window's going on. And that's just varies from lake to lake. So that's it, guys. Helps you out. I know it will help you out like right now. If you guys are fishing this weekend or within the next couple weeks, give both of these a try. Two of my top favorite springtime lures for numbers and quality both. So again, thanks for tuning in. If you guys like the video, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't, and much appreciated, and we'll see you later.